Liverpool had always carried two faces. One was bright and loud, filled with football chants, tourists along the waterfront, and music drifting through narrow streets. The other lived quietly underneath, hidden from visitors and ignored by most residents. This second Liverpool moved through back rooms, storage yards, and forgotten corners near the docks. It was a world built on favors, fear, and long memories. For decades, this shadow world followed rules that rarely changed, passed down from one generation of criminals to the next. The port was the heart of everything. Containers arrived day and night, stacked like metal walls that hid more than cargo. Among legal shipments, illegal goods flowed smoothly, protected by corrupt contacts and trusted routines. Local gangs controlled these routes with confidence. They believed no one knew the docks better than them. Every truck, every warehouse, and every shortcut had been claimed long ago. Outsiders were allowed only if they paid heavily or stayed silent. Police pressure came and went, but it never truly broke the system. Arrests were made, headlines appeared, and then life returned to normal. The gangs adapted easily. They learned which officers could be watched, which routes were safe, and when to disappear for a while. Violence was used carefully. Too much attention was bad for business. Most disputes were settled quietly, leaving no trails that could be followed. To ordinary people, Liverpool felt safe enough. Families walked near the water, workers passed the docks without questions, and shop owners focused on daily routines. Very few noticed the signs of something darker moving nearby. A locked door that never opened, a warehouse that stayed active only at night, a man who arrived poor and left rich without explanation. These details blended into the city's rhythm. There was also a deep sense of pride among the local gangs. They believed Liverpool belonged to them. Stories of past battles were shared like legends, reminding younger members who truly controlled the streets. Foreign groups had tried to enter before, but most failed. Some were pushed out. Others disappeared quietly. The city had a way of rejecting those who did not understand its unwritten laws. Yet beneath this confidence, cracks were forming. Greed had grown stronger than loyalty. Old friendships were weakened by secret deals. Money changed hands more often, and trust became rare. The underworld still looked stable, but it was standing on fragile ground. A single shock was enough to bring everything down. That shock did not arrive with noise or violence. It came quietly, almost politely, carried by the routine movement of ships and paperwork. No alarms were raised. No warnings were given. Liverpool continued its daily life, unaware that someone was watching closely, learning patiently, and remembering events the city had long forgotten. The port that once symbolized control and safety for the underworld was about to become the place where its biggest mistake would finally surface. Arben Kodra arrived in Liverpool without drawing attention, the way countless newcomers had before him. There were no rumors, no sudden displays of wealth, and no visible signs that marked him as different. He rented a modest flat not far from the docks and registered a small logistics consulting business that appeared ordinary in every way. To officials and neighbors, he was just another quiet foreign professional trying to build a life in a working city. His days followed a careful routine. He visited shipping offices, spoke with warehouse managers, and attended industry meetings where names and numbers flowed freely. He listened far more than he spoke. Every conversation added another piece to a growing picture. He learned which companies moved goods faster than others, which managers cut corners, and which drivers were known for keeping secrets. None of this information seemed dangerous on its own, but together it formed a detailed map of Liverpool's hidden systems. Arben understood that power in Liverpool did not come from loud threats or street-level control. It lived in paperwork, schedules, and access. He focused on the boring details others ignored: delivery times, storage costs, insurance claims. By offering solutions that saved money, he gained trust. By solving problems quietly, he earned respect. People began recommending him without knowing why they felt comfortable doing so. Outside of work, Arben spent his evenings walking near the port. He watched ships arrive and leave, noting patterns that never changed. Certain containers were always moved first. Some warehouses stayed lit long after midnight. Trucks followed routes that avoided cameras. He never interfered. Observation was enough. Liverpool's underworld was revealing itself without realizing it was being studied. What no one knew was that Arben kept records of everything. Names, dates, routes, and connections were written down and stored carefully. He compared current operations to old reports and archived data from other ports across Europe. Similar patterns appeared again and again. The same methods, the same mistakes. Liverpool was not unique. It was predictable. Arben's calm behavior hid a disciplined mind shaped by years of experience elsewhere. He had learned that revenge did not require speed. It required accuracy. Rushing led to exposure. Waiting created invisibility. While local criminals relied on reputation and fear, Arben relied on patience and memory. He allowed the city to accept him before it ever questioned him. Small changes began to appear around him. A shipping contract moved to a different company. A warehouse lease changed hands quietly. A transport route was adjusted without explanation. None of these events caused concern, but together they shifted control inch by inch. The underworld did not notice because no violence announced the change. By the time certain names began to recognize Arben's influence, it was already too late to trace his beginnings. He had embedded himself into Liverpool's systems so deeply that removing him would cause disruption. What looked like an ordinary arrival had already become the foundation of something far more dangerous, something built not on force, but on knowledge and long-held intent. Years before Liverpool ever entered his plans, Arben Kodra's life had been shaped by a single disappearance that was never officially recorded. His younger cousin, Besnik Kodra, had been ambitious but inexperienced, drawn toward fast money and dangerous promises. Besnik had left home believing he was stepping into a temporary opportunity connected to overseas trade. He never returned. At first, the family assumed delays and excuses were part of the journey. Days turned into weeks, and silence replaced hope. Information came slowly and in fragments. A contact mentioned a deal that had gone wrong. Another hinted at a port city in the United Kingdom where the shipment had vanished. No names were spoken openly. Fear controlled the details. Authorities offered nothing useful, and official records showed no trace of Besnik's movements. Without a body, the case dissolved into uncertainty. To the world, Besnik had simply faded away. Arben refused to accept that explanation. He began searching quietly, starting with old shipping documents, informal reports, and whispers passed between people who thought they were being careful. Over time, a pattern emerged. Several failed operations across Europe pointed toward the same routes and intermediaries. Liverpool appeared repeatedly, always at the edge of the story, never fully exposed. It was a place where mistakes disappeared, along with the people who made them. The deeper Arben looked, the clearer the betrayal became. Besnik had not been careless. He had been misled. Trusted partners had sold information to protect themselves. When the deal collapsed, Besnik became a problem that needed to be erased. His disappearance was not an accident. It was a decision made by people who believed they would never be held accountable. This knowledge changed Arben permanently. Anger did not consume him. It sharpened him. He learned to control emotion and replace it with focus. Revenge to him was not about pain or chaos. It was about balance. The scales had been tipped unfairly, and restoring them required intelligence, not rage. For years, Arben waited. He watched how similar betrayals unfolded in other cities. He studied how criminal networks protected themselves and how they eventually failed. He noted that most fell not because of violence, but because of arrogance. They believed time erased consequences. That belief became their weakness. Liverpool became the final destination, not because it was convenient, but because it was central. The men connected to Besnik's disappearance had grown powerful there. They controlled routes that stretched far beyond the city. Touching Liverpool meant touching everything they depended on. Arben understood that confronting them directly would only create another unsolved case. The city required a different approach. By the time Arben set foot in Liverpool, the past was no longer a wound. It was a guide. Every choice he made was measured against one question. Would this bring him closer to the truth that had been buried? The city did not know it yet, but it was already carrying the weight of an old mistake, one that had waited patiently to be remembered. The changes began so quietly that no one could point to a clear starting moment. There were no public fights, no sudden arrests, and no dramatic losses that demanded attention. Instead, small disruptions appeared in places that mattered most. A shipment arrived incomplete. A delivery was delayed without explanation. A trusted driver failed to show up and was replaced overnight. Each problem seemed minor on its own, easily blamed on bad luck or paperwork errors. Behind these disruptions was a careful strategy. Arben Kodra understood that open violence would unite his enemies. Silence would divide them. He targeted systems rather than people, knowing that criminals depended on stability as much as any legal business. By interfering with routines, he created uncertainty. When money slowed, suspicion grew. Long-standing partners began to question each other, searching for betrayal within their own circles. Arben's network expanded through necessity rather than fear. Individuals who felt pushed aside by local gangs were offered quiet opportunities. These were not demands, but choices presented as solutions to their problems. Loyalty was earned through reliability. Payments arrived on time. Promises were kept. In an underworld built on broken trust, consistency became a powerful weapon. Warehouse leases shifted ownership through legal channels. Transport contracts changed hands after sudden inspections and compliance issues. Insurance claims rose, forcing companies to distance themselves from risky partners. Each move followed the law closely enough to avoid attention, yet disrupted criminal operations deeply. Liverpool's underworld found itself losing control without understanding how. Rumors spread quickly, but they lacked direction. Some blamed rival gangs. Others suspected police pressure or internal leaks. Meetings were held, alliances were tested, and old friendships weakened. The fear was not of violence, but of uncertainty. No one could identify the source of the problem, and that made it impossible to confront. Arben remained invisible throughout it all. His name rarely surfaced, and when it did, it was dismissed as unimportant. He was seen as a facilitator, not a leader. This misconception protected him. By the time certain figures realized how many routes depended on his connections, removing him would cause financial collapse. What made the situation worse for the local gangs was their own pride. They believed control of territory meant control of power. Arben proved otherwise. Power flowed through access, not street presence. By controlling who could move goods and when, he controlled outcomes without ever appearing at the center. As profits dropped, desperation increased. Mistakes followed. Some gangs took risks they would have avoided before. Others tried to expand into unfamiliar territory, creating new conflicts. Liverpool's underworld, once stable and predictable, became fragile and reactive. By the end of this silent phase, the city had already changed. The old leaders still held their titles, but their influence was hollow. Arben had not announced his presence or his intentions, yet the foundations of the criminal world were shifting beneath their feet. The takeover was not marked by noise or blood. It was marked by absence, and that made it far more dangerous. The tension that had been building beneath Liverpool's underworld finally broke in a way no one expected. It did not begin with a public shootout or a reckless attack. Instead, it arrived as a discovery that sent a clear signal to everyone who understood the rules of the streets. A powerful figure, known for controlling key dock routes and enforcing loyalty through fear, was found dead near an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the port district. The location itself was meaningful. It was a place tied to old operations, forgotten by most, but remembered by those who had been active for decades. The circumstances were unsettling because they revealed almost nothing. There were no witnesses willing to speak, no surveillance footage that explained what had happened, and no obvious weapon left behind. The scene looked carefully arranged, stripped of clues. This was not an impulsive act driven by anger. It was deliberate and controlled. The absence of chaos made it more frightening than open violence. News traveled fast through criminal channels. Meetings were canceled. Movement slowed. Trusted messengers were replaced. Everyone understood that a boundary had been crossed. For months, disruptions had been tolerated because they could be explained away. This could not. Someone had chosen a target that mattered and removed him without leaving a trail. Speculation spread wildly. Some believed a rival gang had finally acted. Others suspected a foreign group testing its strength. A few whispered about internal betrayal, the idea that someone close had opened the door. No theory felt complete, and that uncertainty multiplied the fear. When enemies cannot be identified, everyone becomes a suspect. Police activity increased around the docks, adding another layer of pressure. Yet even with added attention, no arrests followed. The lack of progress only reinforced the idea that this killing operated under different rules. It suggested planning that extended beyond local knowledge, beyond the habits police had learned to predict. What made the event more disturbing was what followed. There was no retaliation, no immediate revenge. Silence settled in instead. That silence carried meaning. It suggested confidence, as if the person responsible did not fear consequences. In the underworld, restraint after violence often signaled control. Behind the scenes, Arben Kodra continued his routine unchanged. He attended meetings, answered calls, and handled logistics as he always had. Those who interacted with him noticed nothing unusual. That normalcy was intentional. The killing was not meant to announce his presence. It was meant to confirm his reach. The death marked a turning point. Smaller gangs began pulling back, unwilling to risk exposure. Some sought protection through new alliances. Others quietly exited operations they once dominated. Power did not shift overnight, but its direction was clear. Fear was no longer generated by reputation or numbers. It was generated by precision. Liverpool's underworld understood one thing with certainty after that moment. The silent phase was over. A line had been crossed, and the person who crossed it had chosen to be unseen rather than untouchable. That choice made the future far more dangerous than the past. As pressure mounted, the investigation into the warehouse death began to pull at threads that had long been buried. Authorities revisited old case files connected to the docks, many of which had been closed without answers. Patterns emerged that had been overlooked at the time. Disappearances, missing shipments, and unexplained financial transfers all pointed toward the same limited network of routes and intermediaries. What once looked like isolated incidents now formed a connected history of controlled silence. Within this growing picture, a name resurfaced that had never been fully examined. Besnik Kodra appeared in a forgotten report linked to an unregistered cargo movement years earlier. At the time, the file had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Now, with fresh data and digital tools, the connection seemed deliberate rather than accidental. The route matched the warehouse location almost exactly. This discovery triggered renewed interest among investigators, but it also spread quietly through criminal circles. Those who remembered Besnik understood the implication. His disappearance had not been erased by time. It had simply waited. Fear deepened as people realized the recent killing was not about territory or money. It was about history. Financial records began to tell the same story. Shell companies tied to dock operations showed sudden changes in ownership over the years. Profits had been redirected carefully, avoiding attention. The same names appeared repeatedly, always one step removed from responsibility. The system had protected them, but it had also recorded them. As evidence accumulated, a disturbing realization took shape. The recent disruptions and the warehouse death were not reactions to current conflicts. They were chapters in a much older plan. Every delayed shipment, every broken alliance, had served to weaken specific individuals connected to Besnik's betrayal. The revenge was not emotional. It was structural. Arben Kodra's involvement remained invisible in official documents, but his influence became harder to deny. Companies linked indirectly to him had benefited from every shift. Routes he facilitated remained untouched by disruptions. Those who relied on his network survived, while others collapsed. This selective stability exposed a quiet hierarchy that had gone unnoticed. For the first time, Liverpool's underworld felt truly exposed. The danger was no longer confined to street-level enforcement or predictable rivalries. It reached into the past, into records and memories people believed were lost. Trust in time itself began to crumble. Authorities faced a familiar problem. They could see the pattern, but proving intent was far more difficult. The lack of direct evidence protected the architect behind the changes. Each move was legal enough on its own. Together, they formed a picture that could not easily be presented in court. By the end of this phase, one truth became clear to those paying attention. The warehouse death was not the beginning of violence. It was the reveal. It showed that the past had finally caught up with Liverpool's underworld, and that someone had been patient enough to let the city convict itself through its own forgotten crimes. Here is the expanded Chapter 6, around 500 words, written smoothly to match your documentary style, with simple language, suspense, no repetition, and no dialogue. As pressure increased after the warehouse death, old investigations were quietly reopened. Detectives began reviewing port-related cases that had once been labeled unsolvable. Many of these files involved missing cargo, false documentation, and individuals who vanished without explanation. At the time, each case had been treated separately. Now, when viewed together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. One forgotten name surfaced repeatedly in these records. Besnik Kodra appeared in shipping logs, linked to a suspicious container movement from years earlier. The shipment had arrived in Liverpool, but never reached its final destination. The paperwork was incomplete, and the company responsible no longer existed. At the time, the trail ended there. With modern financial tracking, investigators discovered that the same route had been reused many times by the same hidden group. This discovery caused unease within the criminal world as well. Those who remembered Besnik understood what it meant. His disappearance had never been random. It had been organized, planned, and protected. The recent killing near the docks suddenly felt connected to something much older. Fear shifted from present threats to past mistakes. Financial investigations deepened the concern. Shell companies tied to dock operations showed strange patterns of ownership changes. Profits had been redirected slowly over the years, avoiding attention. The same intermediaries appeared again and again, always just beyond legal reach. The system had been designed to protect powerful figures, but it had also preserved evidence. As more details surfaced, a disturbing truth became clear. The recent disruptions were not reactions to new conflicts. They were part of a long-term strategy. Every delayed shipment weakened a specific operation. Every broken alliance isolated certain individuals. The revenge was not loud or emotional. It was calculated and precise. Arben Kodra's role remained officially invisible, but his influence was undeniable. Businesses connected to his network were untouched by the chaos. Routes under his control remained stable while others collapsed. Those who aligned with him survived. Those who did not were slowly pushed out. The underworld began to recognize a new structure forming, one built on quiet dominance. For the first time, Liverpool's criminal network felt truly exposed. The danger was no longer limited to rival gangs or police action. It extended into the past, into records and memories people believed were buried forever. Time, once considered a shield, became a threat. Authorities faced a familiar problem. The pattern was clear, but the proof was not. Every move followed legal boundaries closely enough to avoid direct charges. The architect behind the chaos remained untouched, protected by patience and planning. By the end of this phase, one reality was impossible to deny. The warehouse killing was not the beginning of violence. It was the confirmation that revenge had already been completed in stages, and Liverpool's underworld was only now beginning to understand the cost of what it had buried. Liverpool's underworld did not collapse all at once. It reshaped itself slowly, almost quietly, as if the city was adjusting to a new set of rules it never agreed to. The old gang names still existed on paper and in whispers, but their power had faded. Control was no longer measured by street presence or reputation. It was measured by access, timing, and permission. Those who failed to understand this found themselves locked out of roots they once owned. Violence, which had once been a tool to enforce dominance, became rare. One unexplained death had been enough. No further displays were needed. The message was clear. Resistance would not be met with chaos, but with removal. The absence of noise created more anxiety than open conflict ever had. Smaller groups were forced to adapt quickly. Some dissolved entirely, unable to operate without reliable supply lines. Others aligned themselves with new intermediaries who promised stability in exchange for obedience. These changes happened without meetings or announcements. They happened through closed doors, unanswered calls, and routes that simply stopped working. The police noticed the shift as well. Crime statistics showed fewer violent incidents, but financial crimes became harder to trace. Operations grew cleaner, more controlled. The underworld had learned from its mistakes. It no longer relied on unpredictable behavior. It relied on systems that blended into the legal economy. This made intervention more difficult and reduced the chances of exposure. At the center of this transformation was an invisible structure that rewarded patience and punished recklessness. Arben Kodra never claimed leadership, yet his influence was felt everywhere. Those who followed his methods prospered quietly. Those who ignored them vanished from relevance. Power had changed shape, and many never realized it until it was gone. What frightened the old leaders most was not losing money, but losing certainty. They no longer knew who to trust or where decisions were being made. Authority had moved beyond their reach. Even their past alliances offered no protection. The city they once controlled now operated independently of them. It had rewritten the logic of power in Liverpool's criminal world. The city would never return to the way it was. That was the true legacy of the revenge. It did not destroy Liverpool's underworld. It redesigned it, quietly and permanently. Arben Kodra left Liverpool the same way he had entered it, without attention and without explanation. There were no dramatic escapes, no rushed departures, and no signs of fear. One by one, the companies connected to him changed ownership through routine transactions. Office spaces were cleared, leases were ended, Accounts were closed in ways that raised no alarms. To the outside world, it looked like ordinary business movement in a city that never stopped changing. Authorities noticed the absence only after it had become permanent. When they attempted to trace Arben's activities, they found little to follow. Records showed legal operations, proper taxes, and compliance with regulations. There were no warrants waiting, no charges prepared, and no evidence strong enough to justify detention. His name faded from active investigations as quickly as it had appeared. None of the stories could be confirmed. What mattered more than his location was his absence. It proved that control did not require visibility. It required design. Liverpool's criminal world adapted to the new reality. Violence remained rare. Profits were steady. Mistakes were punished not with blood, but with exclusion. Instead, crime blended further into legitimate business. Investigations stalled without clear targets. The revenge that had reshaped the city left no clear villain behind. Years later, Besnik Kodra's disappearance remained officially unresolved. No bodies were found. No arrests were made. Yet within the criminal world, the truth was understood. His story had not ended in silence. It had ended in consequence. Liverpool moved forward, unaware of how deeply it had been changed. The docks continued to operate. Ships arrived and departed. Life went on. But beneath the surface, the rules were different. Trust was rare. Memory was dangerous. Time was no longer protection. Arben Kodra was never seen again in Liverpool, but his presence remained. The revenge he carried out did not announce itself as justice or closure. It existed as a permanent shift, a reminder that some debts are not forgotten, only delayed. In the end, the city learned its lesson quietly, and that silence was the final mark of how completely the underworld had been transformed.